Here's a strange fact most people never hear. The single most dramatic scene in this entire story, one man tearing down an actual stone temple and burying thousands of people under the rubble along with himself, used to be dismissed by serious scholars as obvious exaggeration, the kind of flourish ancient storytellers add for drama. Then archaeologists started digging up real Philistine temples in Israel, and what they found in the dirt made a lot of those scholars go quiet. Over the next 20-some minutes, I'm going to walk you through the entire life of the man behind that story, from a vow placed on him before he was even born, to a relationship that ended with him blind, chained, and grinding grain like an animal in a Philistine prison. Along the way, I'll show you what modern archaeology and even DNA testing have revealed about the real enemies he spent his life fighting, the real towns this all happened in, and why a growing number of historians think the most useful way to understand him isn't as Israel's greatest warrior at all, but as something closer to a walking warning. A man handed extraordinary gifts who, through nothing but his own choices, became his own people's greatest tragedy. To understand how that happens, you have to start with the world he was born into. By the time this story takes place, somewhere around the 12th or 11th century BCE, Israel had no king, no standing army, and no real central government. It was a loose collection of tribes, periodically crushed under the boot of whichever neighboring power happened to be stronger that decade. For 40 straight years, that power was the Philistines, a people who had shown up on the coast of Canaan a generation or two earlier and were not going anywhere. We'll come back to exactly who the Philistines really were, because the answer is stranger and more recent than you'd expect. For now, just picture an oppressed, fractured Israel with one tribe in particular, the tribe of Dan, living right up against the Philistine border, close as enough to watch their crops, their water, and their daughters fall under foreign control. It's into this tribe, in a town called Zorah, that our story actually begins, with a woman who has no children and, as far as anyone in that culture is concerned, no future. An angel appears to her with a message. She's going to have a son. But this son comes with conditions attached before he's even conceived. He is to be a Nazirite from birth, a category normally reserved for adults who took on a temporary vow of consecration to God, never cutting their hair, never drinking wine or anything made from grapes, never touching a dead body. For this child, none of that is optional, and none of it has an expiration date. He is, from the womb, going to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. They name him Samson. In Hebrew, the name comes from the word for son, shemesh, and means something close to little son or son-child. For a long stretch of the 20th century, that detail sent a lot of scholars down a rabbit hole, arguing Samson was originally a sun god, pointing out that he grows up near a town literally called Beth Shemesh, house of the sun, and that his 7 uncut locks might symbolize sunbeams. Most modern scholars now consider that theory mostly abandoned, calling it more clever than convincing. The version that's gained far more traction instead places Samson in a different, older category. The international strongman folk hero, the same archetype behind figures like Gilgamesh's companion Enkidu in Mesopotamia, and later Heracles in Greece. a superhuman wrecking ball of a man, equal parts blessing and liability, who solves every problem with brute force and usually creates 3 new ones in the process. Samson grows up and, true to that archetype, the first thing we learn about him as an adult isn't a battle, it's a crush. He travels into Philistine territory, to a town called Timnah, and sees a Philistine woman he wants to marry. His parents are horrified. Marrying outside Israel, marrying into the very people oppressing them, is exactly what a Nazirite, exactly what any Israelite is supposed to avoid. He doesn't care. He wants her, and the narrative drops a strange little aside here, telling us this entire impulsive decision was actually being used by God behind the scenes to create a pretext for conflict with the Philistines. Even Samson's worst instincts, it turns out, are being put to work. On the road to go see her, he runs into a young lion and tears it apart with his bare hands, telling no one. Later, on his way back for the wedding, he passes the carcass again and finds a swarm of bees has built a hive inside it, full of honey. He eats some, gives some to his parents, still without explaining where it came from, a small detail commentators often flag as the first quiet crack in his vow, since contact with a corpse was explicitly off-limits for a Nazirite, and he's just elbow-deep in a dead lion's ribcage. Here's where the archaeology gets genuinely interesting. In 2012, archaeologists excavating at Beth Shemesh, essentially in Samson's own backyard, unearthed a tiny stone seal, barely the size of a coin, stamped with an image of a man locked in combat with a lion. It dates to roughly the same period and the same region this story is set in. Nobody is claiming it's a portrait of Samson, but it's solid evidence that the image of a heroic man wrestling a lion was already culturally alive in exactly this corner of the world, around exactly this time, which tells you the story didn't appear out of nowhere. It was speaking a visual language the original audience already recognized. At the wedding feast, which traditionally ran 7 days, Samson poses a riddle to 30 Philistine groomsmen, betting 30 sets of fine clothing that they can't solve it. Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. A riddle only he knows the answer to, because only he knows about the lion and the honey. For 3 days they're stumped. Annoyed and a little desperate, they threaten his new wife, telling her to get the answer out of him, or they'll burn her father's house down with her in it. She turns the pressure on Samson directly, crying and pestering him for the rest of the week, until, worn down, he finally tells her. She immediately tells them. When the Philistines solve the riddle just under the wire, Samson knows exactly what happened, and his response tells you everything about his temperament. He doesn't argue. He travels to the Philistine city of Ashkelon, kills 30 men, strips their clothing, and uses it to pay off the bet he lost because his own wife sold him out. Then he goes home alone, furious, abandoning his new bride entirely. Her father, assuming the marriage is over, gives her to another man instead. This is, somehow, only the beginning of the cycle. When Samson cools down and goes back to claim her, he finds out she's married to someone else. Her father offers him her younger sister as a consolation prize. Samson does not take this well. He catches 300 foxes, ties a torch between each pair of their tails, and releases them into the Philistines' grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves, burning an entire season's harvest to the ground over a personal grudge. In retaliation, the Philistines burn his former wife and her father alive. Samson responds to that with what the text simply calls a great slaughter, then retreats to a cave to wait it out. The Philistines pressure the tribe of Judah to hand him over, and 3,000 Judahite men show up to do exactly that, not out of malice, but exhaustion. They're tired of being collectively punished for one man's personal vendetta. Samson agrees to be tied up and handed over on one condition: they don't kill him themselves. When the Philistines arrive to collect him, shouting in celebration, the ropes around him snap like they were never there, and Samson grabs the nearest weapon available, the dried jawbone of a dead donkey, and kills 1,000 men with it on the spot. Notice the pattern building here. Every single one of these episodes starts with personal humiliation or heartbreak, not patriotism, not strategy, not a divine mission statement. Samson isn't leading a resistance movement. He's a one-man wrecking crew running on rage and wounded pride, who happens to be doing damage to Israel's enemies as an accidental side effect of working through his own emotions in the worst possible way. After this, the text drops in an odd little detail. He judged Israel for 20 years. It's easy to miss, tucked between one act of violence and the next, but it's worth sitting with. For 2 full decades, this man, with zero interest in leadership, zero apparent self-control, and a track record of solving every problem by burning something down, was, officially, the most powerful authority figure Israel had. Then comes Gaza, and a different kind of trouble. Samson spends a night with a prostitute there, and the Philistines, sensing an opportunity, quietly surround the city gates, planning to kill him at dawn. At midnight, he simply gets up, rips the entire city gate, doors, posts, and crossbar off its foundation, and carries it roughly 38 miles to Hebron, just to make a point. It's an absurd, almost cartoonish flex of strength, and it's also the last time in the story his power shows up completely unearned, with no cost attached yet. The cost arrives in the valley of Sorek, in the form of a woman named Delilah. The Philistine leadership offers her a small fortune in silver, more money than most people in that era would see in a lifetime for one piece of information. The secret to Samson's strength. She doesn't sneak around. She asks him directly, repeatedly, and he lies to her, repeatedly, almost like he's enjoying the game. "Tie me with fresh bowstrings," he says, and Philistine soldiers hide in the room, only for him to snap the strings like burnt thread the moment they spring the trap. "Tie me with new unused rope," he says next, same result. "Weave my hair into your loom," he tells her a third time, and he simply stands up afterward and walks off with the loom still attached to his head. 3 times the Philistines hide in that room, waiting to capture a man who is, very obviously, lying to the woman he's involved with about the literal mechanism keeping him alive. Eventually, Delilah stops asking and starts wearing him down emotionally instead, telling him his lies prove he doesn't really love her, pressing him day after day, until the text says he was worn out to the point of death just from her nagging. He finally cracks and tells her the truth. His strength is tied to a vow he's never told anyone about, sealed by hair that has never once been cut. This time she knows it's real. She lulls him to sleep, calls in a man to shave his head completely, and when she tests him by waking the Philistines hiding nearby, his strength is simply gone. The text is specific about why, and it's not really about the hair at all. It says the Lord had left him. The hair was only ever the visible marker of an invisible vow, and Samson had already been quietly breaking that vow, piece by piece for years. The dead lion, the wine at his own wedding feast, probably more we're never told about. The haircut isn't what destroyed him. It's just the moment everyone, including Samson himself, finally had to admit what had already happened. The Philistines gouge out his eyes, chain him in bronze, and put him to work grinding grain in a Gaza prison, a job typically given to women or to animals. A final, deliberate humiliation for a man once strong enough to carry off a city gate. And there, in the dark, doing the most degrading labor his captors could think of, his hair quietly starts growing back. Some time later, the Philistines throw a massive feast to celebrate their god Dagon, crediting him for delivering their greatest enemy into their hands, and in their celebration they decide it would be entertaining to drag the blind, broken Samson out in front of the crowd to be mocked. He asks the boy guiding him to position him between the two central support pillars of the temple, as if to lean on them for support. Then, silently, he prays for his strength one final time and pushes. For decades, critics pointed to exactly this detail, two central pillars holding up an entire roof, as proof the story was pure fiction. No real temple, they argued, would ever be engineered that way. Then, starting in the 1970s, archaeologists began excavating actual Philistine temples from this exact period at a site called Tel Karksil, and later at Tel Mikne Ekron, and later still at Tel Es Safi, identified as ancient Gath. All four temples shared the same unusual design, a main hall with its roof held up by two wooden pillars, resting on stone bases set only 6 or 7 feet apart, close enough together that one sufficiently strong, sufficiently desperate man really could have shoved both off their footing at once and brought the whole structure down. The detail that once sounded like the most obviously made-up part of the story turned out to match real Philistine architecture almost exactly. The collapse kills everyone inside. By some traditions, several thousand people, along with Samson himself. The text notes almost as an epitaph that he killed more people in that single final act than in his entire life up to that point. His family recovers his body and buries him in his father's tomb. And with that, the strongest man in the Hebrew Bible dies exactly the way he lived, solving a problem with overwhelming, indiscriminate force, at enormous personal cost, having never actually finished the job he was supposedly born to do. Now, who were these Philistines who run through this entire story as the villain? For a long time, that was mostly guesswork based on pottery styles and a single biblical reference to a homeland called Kaftor, generally identified with Crete. Then, in 2019, researchers analyzing DNA recovered from a Philistine cemetery and from infant burials in the ancient city of Ashkelon got an actual answer. The earliest Philistine settlers, dating to right around the 12th century BCE, carried a noticeable amount of European-related ancestry, not found in the local population before their arrival, a genetic signature most consistent with origins somewhere in the Aegean world, possibly Crete, possibly Greece, arriving in the chaotic aftermath of the same civilizational collapse that ended the Bronze Age across the entire Mediterranean. Within only a couple of centuries, that distinct genetic signal had already been diluted away through intermarriage with the local Levantine population, even as the Philistines kept their separate cultural identity for another 400 years. Samson wasn't fighting some vague, abstract enemy. He was fighting the descendants of actual Aegean migrants who'd shown up on that coastline a generation or two before he was born and never left. So who was Samson, really? Strip away the argument over solar myths and folklore, and what's left is a figure most scholars today treat as something in between pure legend and verified history, a real local strongman from a real specific place near Beth Shemesh, whose actual exploits against the Philistines got told, retold, and gradually shaped into an epic over generations, the same way real outlaws and warriors in other cultures eventually become folk heroes once their stories get passed down long enough. That's the real ending underneath the famous one. The strongest man in the story isn't brought down by the Philistines at all. He's brought down by himself, one small, deniable compromise at a time, until the day finally comes when the only strength he has left is just enough to bring the whole building down with him.